Story number 1. Imagine a highway so desolate that the night itself seems to breathe. Its icy exhale curling around your tires as you drive. In the winter of 2019, on a forgotten stretch of Interstate 80 in Wyoming, a trucker named Danny Rodriguez would come face to face with something that didn't belong in the world of the living. The stars were hidden behind a shroud of clouds, and the snow fell like a curtain, blurring the line between earth and oblivion. Danny, a man who'd spent 15 years hauling freight across America's arteries, was no stranger to long, lonely nights, but this night would carve itself into his memory. A scar that would never fade. 3 trucks, ancient and spectral, trailed him through the blizzard, their headlights like eyes that never blinked. This is the story of a man who stared into the void of Interstate 80 and found it staring back, hungry for another soul to claim. The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, a sound so mournful it could wake the dead. Danny's rig rumbled through the snow, its engine straining against the cold. He was a veteran of the road, a man whose steady hands and sharper instincts had carried him through storms, breakdowns, and worse. But tonight, something was wrong. The highway was empty. Unnaturally so, as if the world had been abandoned. The dashboard clock glowed faintly, marking the hours past midnight. Danny's load, electronics bound for Chicago, was already delayed by a storm that had swept in from the Rockies. The temperature had dropped to -5 degrees, and a light snow was making the road treacherous enough that Danny had to keep his speed down to about 50 mph. He adjusted his mirrors, catching the faint glow of headlights behind him, 3 sets, perfectly aligned, trailing a quarter-mile back. At first, Danny didn't think much of it. Truckers often traveled together for safety, especially in bad weather. But as the miles ticked by, a chill unrelated to the weather crept into his bones. The trucks behind him were too precise, their movements too synchronized. Danny eased off the gas, letting his speed dip to navigate a steep incline. The convoy slowed in perfect unison. He pushed the pedal down on a flat stretch, coaxing his rig to 60 mph. The trucks matched him, never closing the gap, never falling behind. It was like they were tethered to him by an invisible rope. Curiosity turned to unease. Danny flicked on his CB radio, his voice steady but tinged with caution. Eastbound driver at mile marker 235, looking to chat with the 3 trucks behind me. You guys copy? Silence. He cycled through the channels, expecting the usual banter of late-night truckers. Nothing, only static, thick and heavy, with faint distortions that sounded almost like voices if he lingered on them too long. The highway stretched on, a ribbon of asphalt swallowed by the dark. And Danny realized he hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour. A major interstate like I-80 should have had some life, even at this hour, but it was just him and them. Danny's rig growled as he crested a hill, the snow swirling thicker now. In his mirrors, he caught his first clear glimpse of the convoy. All 3 were older models. He could tell by their headlight configuration and the shape of their cabs. They were relics, straight out of the 1980s, with boxy silhouettes and round headlights that pierced the blizzard like unblinking stares. What struck him as odd was that despite the freezing weather and blowing snow, none of them had their running lights on. Just headlights cutting through the darkness like 6 glowing eyes. The sight sent a prickle down his spine. These weren't the sleek, modern rigs he was used to seeing. They belonged to another era, one that should have been left behind. The feeling of unease grew stronger when Danny realized he hadn't seen any other traffic for over an hour. The world felt wrong, as if he'd driven into a place where time had stopped, and he was the only living thing left. Determined to shake the convoy, Danny decided to test his followers. He signaled and pulled into a rest area at mile marker 250, expecting the trucks to pass or stop. Instead, they slowed down and parked in a line at the far end of the rest area. Engines running, headlights still on, their beams cut through the falling snow, pinning Danny's rig in their gaze. He squinted, trying to make out the drivers. Danny could see the silhouettes of drivers in each cab, but they weren't moving. They were just sitting there watching him. The rest area was a ghost town. No cars, no other trucks, no signs of life. The sodium lights overhead flickered, casting shadows that danced across the pavement without reason. Danny stepped out, his boots crunching in the snow, and approached the rest area's building. A faded sign hung on the door, its handwriting jagged, closed until further notice. He turned back, glancing at the trucks. They hadn't moved. Their engines idled, a low, steady growl that seemed to vibrate in his chest. Danny climbed back into his cab, his breath visible in the freezing air. He pulled out of the rest area, glancing in his mirrors as he merged back onto the highway. The three trucks followed immediately, falling back into their perfect formation exactly a quarter mile behind him. The road wound through small towns, their lights dim and lifeless, as if the storm had swallowed their inhabitants. Danny's unease had grown into something heavier, a dread that pressed against his ribs. He tried the CB again, his voice sharper now. "This is eastbound at mile marker 260. Anyone out there?" The static answered, unbroken, unyielding. He pushed on, the snow piling higher, the road growing slicker. The convoy stayed with him, relentless, their headlights a constant presence in his mirrors. This continued for another 50 miles through small towns that should have shown signs of life, but appeared completely abandoned. Danny's mind raced, searching for explanations. Were they playing a prank? Smugglers avoiding attention? But no prank felt this wrong, and no smuggler would drive so openly, so eerily precise. The night deepened, and the cold seeped into the cab. Despite the heater running full blast, Danny's rig began to falter, the engine coughing as he climbed a long uphill grade. The temperature gauge began climbing toward the red zone, and he could smell burning coolant. Panic clawed at him. A breakdown in this weather, in this nowhere place, was more than an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. He coaxed the truck to the top of the grade, but the engine gave out. The rig rolling to a stop on the shoulder, Danny managed to coax his truck to the top of the grade before it died completely. Rolling to a stop on the shoulder with his hazard lights flashing, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the wind and the faint hum of the convoy's engines. The three trucks that had been following him didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. They glided past at highway speed, their headlights sweeping over his rig. Danny leaned forward, peering through the snow, while each cab appeared to be empty. No driver visible behind the wheel, no movement inside. His heart pounded. As the third truck passed, Danny noticed something that made his blood run cold. Painted on the back of the trailer in faded letters was a company name he recognized, Westbound Freight Company. Danny knew that name. Westbound Freight had been a small outfit in the 1980s, based out of Wyoming. It had collapsed after a tragedy in 1987, when 3 of its drivers vanished in a blizzard. Their trucks found abandoned on Interstate 80 with no trace of what had happened to the men. The story was a legend among truckers, a cautionary tale whispered over coffee at diners. Danny sat frozen, his breath shallow. As the convoy's taillights faded into the storm, the temperature inside his cab was already dropping, and he knew he had maybe an hour before hypothermia became a real concern. He fumbled for his cell phone. No signal. The CB radio crackled to life on its own. Unprompted, voices emerged from the static, calm and conversational, discussing weather and routes. 3 men discussing the weather, road conditions, and their delivery schedule. But the details were wrong. They spoke of a truck stop in Cheyenne, long demolished, and a construction zone finished 15 years ago. Then, a voice cut through, chillingly clear. "We've got a driver broken down at mile marker 285. Should we go back and help him?" Another replied, "Nah, let him freeze. We've got a schedule to keep." A third voice laughed, hollow and cold. "He'll be joining us soon enough anyway." The radio crackled again, and one of the voices spoke directly to him. "Don't worry, Danny. The cold isn't so bad once you get used to it. We've been driving these roads for 37 years now, and the winter nights don't bother us anymore." Danny's blood turned to ice. They knew his name, his exact location. Headlights approached from behind, not steady beams, but flickering, wavering lights that seemed to dance in the darkness. The convoy was returning, driving backward down the interstate at impossible speed. Their trucks were decayed, rusted hulks, their windshields frosted over despite running engines. The lead truck stopped directly behind Danny's trailer. A door opened, and footsteps crunched through the snow toward his cab. But when Danny looked in his mirrors, he couldn't see anyone walking. 3 knocks echoed on his driver's side door, slow and deliberate. A voice called out, muffled but clear. "Engine trouble. Friend, we can give you a ride." It was calm, almost kind, but laced with something unnatural like frost on a grave. "We know these roads real well, been driving them longer than most folks have been alive." Danny didn't move. Every instinct screamed at him to stay still, to ignore the voice. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Come on, Danny. Don't be rude. We know you're in there, and we know you're getting mighty cold. Open up, and we'll get you warmed up real nice." His breath fogged the air, his hands trembling, not just from the cold. The temperature in the cab was plummeting, and his body was starting to shut down. But he knew with a certainty deeper than logic, that opening that door would mean crossing a threshold he could never return from. Suddenly, a new engine roared in the distance, and real headlights, steady, warm, human, cut through the storm. A Wyoming State Troopers patrol car pulled up, its red and blue lights flashing. The 3 trucks were different now, their paint completely faded, tires flat and cracked, frost covering every surface. The trooper's voice came over the PA. "Driver of the disabled vehicle, this is Wyoming State Police.
Are you all right in there?"
Danny grabbed the CB, his voice shaky but relieved. "I'm okay, officer. Engine overheated. But there are 3 trucks here." He stopped, glancing in his mirrors. The trucks were gone, vanished completely, as if they had never been there. The trooper helped Danny fix his rig, a simple issue with a coolant hose that shouldn't have caused such a catastrophic failure. As they worked, Danny recounted the night's events. The trooper listened, his face unreadable, until Danny finished. "You're not the first driver to report seeing westbound freight trucks on this stretch of highway," the officer said. "We get maybe 3 or 4 reports a year, always during winter storms, always involving drivers who break down around mile marker 285. He paused, his voice low. "The strange thing is, we investigated the original disappearance of those westbound drivers back in '87, found their trucks right here in this exact spot with the engines running and the heaters on full blast, but the cabs were frozen solid inside like they'd been sitting empty in the cold for days." Danny's rig sputtered back to life, and he completed his run to Chicago without further incident. But he's never driven that stretch of I-80 through Wyoming again, especially not in winter. He now takes a southern route, adding 2 days to his journey. 2 extra days of driving is a small price to pay to avoid spending eternity in a convoy of dead truckers. He says, "The Wyoming State Police have files on 17 similar encounters over the past 3 decades. 17 drivers who broke down at mile marker 285 and reported being approached by the phantom westbound freight convoy. 3 of those drivers were never seen again, their trucks found frozen, engines running with no trace of them. The police won't officially comment on the disappearances, but Officer Mitchell Thompson, who helped Danny that night, retired from the force 6 months later. In his final interview, he left a haunting warning. Some roads hold on to their ghosts, and some ghosts aren't content to just haunt, they're still trying to complete their routes. And they're always looking for drivers to join their convoy. The story didn't end with Danny's escape. The stretch of Interstate 80 near mile marker 285 remains a whispered legend among truckers. Some claim to have seen the convoy on moonless nights, their headlights flickering like lanterns in a fog. Others speak of CB radios picking up voices that shouldn't exist, talking about routes long forgotten. Danny, now nearing retirement, keeps a journal of his years on the road. That night in Wyoming takes up more pages than any other. He writes of the cold that wasn't just physical, of the voices that knew too much, of the trucks that shouldn't have been there. He wonders if he escaped because of the trooper, or because the convoy wasn't ready to claim him yet. The truly disturbing part of this story isn't just Danny's experience, it's that the Wyoming State Police confirmed they have files on 17 similar encounters over the past 32 years. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howls across the plains, truckers still report a faint static on their radios and a voice that says, "We're still out here, friend. Always room for one more." Story number 2. I was a long-haul trucker, 8 years on the road, and I prided myself on knowing every major highway across the country like the back of my hand. My name's Lisa Patterson Toy, and I could drive from Seattle to Miami blindfolded. No GPS, just my memory of interstates, truck stops, and hidden shortcuts most drivers never found. That humid August night in 2021, I was hauling furniture from North Carolina to Texas, cruising along Interstate 40 ahead of schedule and feeling good, but then the road betrayed me. The detour signs appeared out of nowhere, glowing faintly under my headlights. The highway was shut down due to an overturned chemical truck, forcing me onto back roads that promised to reconnect with Highway 67 south. I wasn't worried at first. I'd driven this detour once, maybe 2 years back. But as the miles stretched on, the road narrowed, and the world around me turned strange. The trees loomed too close now, their branches clawing at the sky, blotting out the moonlight. Something was wrong, and I felt it in my gut before I even knew why. My GPS died 20 minutes into the detour, the screen frozen on a blank grid. My CB radio hissed with static. No voices cutting through. I was alone. Or so I thought, on roads that didn't exist in my atlas. The landscape unnerved me in ways I couldn't explain. Farmhouses stood abandoned, their windows shattered, yards choked with weeds. Yet, fresh tire tracks marked their driveways. Fields that should have been bursting with late summer crops were dead, scorched black as if burned by some unseen fire. And then I saw it, a rusted mailbox shaped like a cow, glinting in my headlights. That mailbox was the first sign I was trapped. I passed it again and again, and then a fourth time, my odometer ticking off hours that made no sense. I'd been driving straight, or so I thought, but the road was looping, folding back on itself like a snake eating its own tail, a dead tree with twisted branches, a red barn with half its roof caved in. They kept appearing, mocking me. I wasn't just lost, I was caught in something that didn't want me to leave. I needed help, and I hated admitting it. I'd always been independent, never needing directions, but getting home safely trumped my pride. The first house I found had a porch light glowing and a TV flickering through the window. I pulled into the gravel driveway, my boots crunching as I walked to the door. When I knocked, the TV went silent, but no one answered. I called out, my voice swallowed by the night. I could hear whispering inside, faint and hurried, like secrets being shared. Then I saw the toys, a tricycle, dolls, a sandbox filled with dead insects and tiny bones, all coated in dust as if untouched for decades. My heart raced. I wasn't welcome here. I scrambled back to my truck, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. The roads were too narrow to turn my rig around, so I kept driving, searching for a wide spot or an intersection. Every house I passed told the same story, lights on, signs of life. But no one answered my knocks. The yards were littered with toys, tricycles, dolls, plastic shovels, arranged as if children had just been playing, yet covered in grime. Untouched for years, the air felt heavy, like it was pressing against my chest, watching me. I checked my mirrors constantly, certain something was following, just beyond my headlights. Shadows flickered in the tree line, too large to be deer, too fluid to be human.
At 2 a.m., I saw her, a woman standing in the middle of the road, bathed in my headlights. She wore a stained white nightgown, her face pale, her eyes locked on my truck with a hunger that made my skin crawl. She didn't move, didn't wave, just stared. I stopped 20 feet away, rolled down my window, and called out, asking if she needed help. No response. Her expression didn't change. I tried again, my voice shaking, but she just stood there, unblinking, like she was waiting for me to make a mistake.
I edged the truck forward, hoping to nudge her aside, but she moved with me, gliding without steps, her feet never touching the ground. A panic clawed at my throat. I threw the truck into reverse, checking my mirrors, and froze. 6 more figures stood behind my truck, all in stained nightgowns, all staring with that same hungry look. They weren't people, not anymore. Their skin was waxy, like melted candles. Their eyes were black voids, no pupils, no whites. When they opened their mouths, I saw teeth, sharp, jagged, packed into human jaws like a predator's maw. My truck's engine started choking, the RPMs spiking, the temperature gauge climbing into the red. Something was wrong with my rig, something that wasn't mechanical. I'd maintained this truck for 3 years without a hitch, but now it was dying, as if the road itself was poisoning it. The figures closed in, their movements jerky, unnatural, like puppets on invisible strings. I had one chance. I slammed the accelerator, aiming straight for the woman in front. She vanished, dissolving like smoke, and the others followed, melting into the darkness. The truck roared back to life, the gauges snapping back to normal. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just drove. The road twisting under my tires. But the screaming started. It came from the trees, with a high-pitched wail that followed me, pacing my truck. I pushed the rig to its limits, taking corners too fast, my heart pounding. After what felt like hours, I saw a sign for Highway 67. Relief flooded me as I merged onto a real road, with real traffic and working streetlights. My GPS flickered back on, and my CB radio crackled with the voices of other truckers. I pulled into the first truck stop, my hands still trembling, and called the Arkansas State Police. The dispatcher listened calmly, almost too calmly. He told me I was the 7th driver that year to report getting lost on those roads and seeing people in nightgowns. They'd sent patrols, but the roads didn't exist on any map, just dense forest where the town of Millfield once stood. Millfield had been abandoned in the 1970s after a chemical plant explosion poisoned the groundwater. The town was razed, the land reclaimed by wilderness, but truckers and hikers still reported seeing its residents, people who didn't know their time had ended. When I got home, I dug into Millfield's history. The explosion happened at night, killing over 200 people in their beds, most in nightgowns. The chemicals altered their bodies in ways the reports only hinted at. Significant physical changes, they called it. I swore I'd never take that route again, and I noticed other truckers avoided those back roads too. Changing the subject when I asked why. 3 weeks later, a package arrived at my home with no return address, postmarked from a Millfield post office closed since 1978. Inside was a doll, identical to one I'd seen in that first yard, dressed in a miniature nightgown stained with dark splotches. A note in faded ink read, "Thank you for visiting Millfield. We hope you'll come back soon. We get so few visitors, and we're always looking for new residents. It was signed with dozens of names, each in different handwriting, like the whole town had written it. I threw the doll away, but it was back on my doorstep the next morning. I burned it, but another arrived within a week, identical, with the same note. This has gone on for over 2 years. Even after I moved twice, the packages always find me. I've upgraded my truck with multiple GPS units and carry detailed maps, but I can't shake the feeling that Millfield isn't done with me. I joined online trucker forums, and I'm not alone. Other drivers talk about towns like Millfield, places wiped off the map but still existing, their residents refusing to leave. The worst part? The Millfield post office, closed since 1973, still sends mail to drivers who've been there, using stamps discontinued decades ago. No one knows how, but the letters keep coming, always with the same invitation to return. The road had changed me, Bam. I used to love the open highway, the freedom of it. Now, every shadow feels like a threat, every detour a trap. I started noticing small things, scratches on my truck that weren't there before, faint whispers on my CB radio even when it's off. One night, I found a child's drawing tucked under my windshield wiper, a crude sketch of a woman in a nightgown, her eyes blacked out, holding a doll. I don't know how it got there, but I burned it just like the dolls. I've learned to live with the fear, but it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind. I avoid rural routes now, sticking to major highways, but sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I feel Millfield calling. It's not just a place, it's a hunger, a need that clings to you. I keep driving, keep moving, but I know one thing for sure. Some roads don't let you go, and Millfield is waiting for me to come back. Story number 3. On a moonless night. The desert stretched endlessly before Marcus Thompson's white Peterbilt, its headlights carving a frail path through the inky blackness of New Mexico's Interstate 40. The veteran trucker gripped the wheel, eyes heavy from hours of driving, the hum of the engine his only companion. Then, a crackle pierced the silence of his CB radio. A voice slicing through the static with chilling clarity. It wasn't the usual chatter of fellow drivers swapping stories or cursing traffic. This voice was different, calm, deliberate, and impossibly close, as if the speaker sat beside him in the cab. Eastbound driver in the white Peterbilt, this is your shadow. You've got a problem with your left rear trailer tire. Better pull over and check it before you have a blowout. Marcus froze, his pulse quickening. He glanced at his mirrors, but the highway behind him was a void. No headlights, no trucks, just darkness swallowing the road. The voice knew his truck, his exact location, down to the color and make. How could anyone see him out here, in the middle of nowhere, where even the stars seemed to hide? Marcus looked in his mirrors, but couldn't see any trucks behind him. The highway was completely empty in both directions. His instincts screamed to keep driving, to dismiss the message as a prank. But tire safety was no joke. A blowout at these speeds could flip his rig, end his career, or worse. He decided to pull over at the next wide spot and do a quick inspection. The desert air was cold as he stepped out, flashlight in hand, the silence so thick it felt alive. As he circled the trailer, the beam of his flashlight caught a glint of rubber, a dangerous bulge on the sidewall of his left rear tire. His breath caught in his throat. The defect was real. A ticking time bomb that could have shredded at any moment, the kind of defect that could cause a catastrophic blowout at highway speeds. He stood there, heart pounding, the voice's warning echoing in his mind. Who was this shadow? How did they know, and why did Marcus feel, deep in his bones, that this was no ordinary call? Back in the cab, Marcus grabbed the CB mic, his voice steady but laced with unease. "Hey, Shadow, This is the white Pete you warned about the tire. You were absolutely right. I've got a bad sidewall bulge. I want to thank you for the heads up. Where are you running? I don't see any trucks in either direction. The response came instantly, cool and cryptic. Don't worry about where I am, driver. Just focus on getting that tire changed safely. You've got about 40 minutes before that sidewall gives out completely. The precision was unnerving, like a prophecy carved in stone. Marcus's hands tightened on the mic. This wasn't just a helpful stranger. This was something else, something that knew too much, saw too much, and refused to be seen. The desert seemed to close in around him, the darkness heavier now, watching. Marcus wasn't a superstitious man, but the hairs on his neck stood on end. He worked to change the tire, the voice guiding him with eerie precision. You'll want to double-check those lug nuts. The third one from the top is still loose. Marcus paused, wrench in hand, and checked. Sure enough, one nut was loose. Just as the voice said. This wasn't guesswork, it was certainty. As if the speaker had already seen the outcome. The night felt alive now, the stars above flickering like eyes. And Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone on this stretch of road. Marcus knelt beside the trailer, the cold desert ground biting through his jeans as he wrestled with the stubborn lug nuts. The voice on the CB didn't let up, offering advice that bordered on clairvoyant. There's a state trooper about 15 miles ahead running radar, so keep it under 70 when you get back on the road. Marcus nodded to himself, committing the warning to memory, though his mind was elsewhere on the voice itself. It was deep, weathered, like it belonged to someone who'd spent decades on these roads. Yet there was a strange sadness woven into every word, a weight that made Marcus's chest tighten. As he worked, the voice shifted from mechanical advice to something far more personal. How's your daughter Sarah doing with her nursing program? Must be tough having her so far away at school. Marcus dropped his wrench, the metal clanging against the asphalt. Sarah, his daughter, studying nursing 800 miles away in Michigan. He'd never spoken her name on the CB, not once in his 12 years of driving. His mouth went dry. How do you know about Sarah? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. The radio crackled, but no answer came. Instead, the voice pressed on. That chest pain you've been having, you really should see a doctor about that when you get home. It's not just heartburn like you keep telling yourself. Marcus's hand instinctively went to his chest, where a dull ache had been plaguing him for weeks. He'd brushed it off as stress, bad food, anything but what it might actually be. But this stranger, this thing, knew. The voice wasn't just guiding him through a tire change, it was peeling back the layers of his life, exposing secrets he hadn't even admitted to himself. He tried to focus, finishing the tire change, but his hands were shaking. Shadow, I really appreciate all your help tonight. What's your handle? Maybe we can stay in touch. The pause that followed was long, heavy, like the desert itself holding its breath.
Finally, the voice returned. Softer now, tinged with something like regret. My handle used to be Night Rider, but I don't use that anymore. Haven't used it since the accident. Marcus's blood ran cold. What accident? He asked, though part of him didn't want the answer. The voice hesitated, then spoke with a quiet finality. Happened right here. Marcus. Same stretch of highway, same time of night. Tire blowout at mile marker 127. Lost control and went off the road. That was, let me see, about 6 years ago now. You'll see the cross marker when you pass mile 127. White cross with some plastic flowers that my wife put there.
Marcus sat back in the driver's seat, staring at the CB radio as if it might explain itself. A dead man? A ghost? He wanted to laugh it off, to call it a sick prank. But the details were too precise, too personal. He started the engine, the rumble grounding him as he pulled back onto the highway. The night stretched out before him. endless and unyielding. But now it carried a new weight. As he drove past mile marker 127, his headlights illuminated a white wooden cross on the side of the highway. Exactly where the voice had said it would be. Plastic flowers faded by years of weather were attached to the cross. Marcus slowed the truck as the cross came into view, its weathered wood glowing faintly under his headlights. He pulled over again, unable to resist the pull of the marker. Stepping out, he approached the cross, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The air felt colder here, heavier. As if the desert itself was mourning, a small metal plate was nailed to the base. Its inscription, barely legible in the dim light, Thomas Knight Rider Williams, 1962 to 2014. Beloved husband and father, keep the shiny side up. Marcus's knees weakened. Thomas Williams, Knight Rider, a man who had died 6 years ago. On this very road, in a crash caused by the same kind of tire failure Marcus had just avoided. His hands were shaking as he keyed his CB radio one final time. Knight Rider, are you still out there? The response was faint, almost lost in the static, but it carried a sorrow that cut through the night. I'm always out here. Marcus, this highway, it holds on to some of us. I couldn't help myself that night, but maybe I can help other drivers avoid the same fate. Take care of yourself and get that chest looked at. Your daughter needs her dad around for a long time. The radio went silent, and Marcus knew it would stay that way. He stood by the cross for a long time, the desert wind whispering around him, carrying voices he couldn't quite hear. When he finally climbed back into his cab, the weight of the encounter settled into his bones. He drove on, the mile markers ticking by, each one a reminder of the thin line between life and death on these lonely roads. 3 days later, Marcus was back in Michigan, sitting in a doctor's office. The tests confirmed what the voice had warned, a heart condition that could have killed him if ignored. The cardiologist was blunt. If Marcus had waited even a few more weeks, a heart attack was almost certain. Likely behind the wheel, surgery followed, and Marcus recovered. But the memory of that night never left him. He dug into the history of Thomas Williams, piecing together the story of a trucker who'd been a legend on these routes, always ready to lend a hand or a word of advice. Marcus's research uncovered more than he expected. Thomas Williams had been a fixture in the trucking community, a man known for his kindness and his knack for spotting trouble before it struck. His death in 2014 had shaken the drivers who knew him, and the cross at mile marker 127 had become a quiet pilgrimage site for those who passed through. But there was more: stories, whispers, shared over diner counters and CB channels, of a voice that still haunted this stretch of Interstate 40. Other drivers had heard from Knight Rider, always at night, always near mile marker 127. The warnings were never wrong: a loose axle, a slick patch of road, a drowsy driver veering into danger. Each story carried the same eerie details: a voice that knew too much, saw too much, and vanished without a trace. The New Mexico State Police had files on it, reports from truckers claiming Knight Rider had saved them from disaster. The legend had grown, and the stretch of highway had earned a name: Knight Rider's Beat. Marcus kept driving, but he was different now. Every time he passed mile marker 127, he'd slow down, tip his hat to the cross, and listen to the CB, hoping for a crackle, a word, anything. He never heard from Knight Rider again, but he carried the story with him, sharing it with other drivers over coffee at truck stops. The trucking community had begun to refer to that stretch of highway as Knight Rider's Beat. and many drivers made a point of thanking the guardian spirit who continued to watch over his fellow truckers long after his own journey ended. The desert doesn't forget its ghosts. Marcus learned that lesson under the stars. On a road that stretched into the unknown, Knight Rider was out there, bound to the asphalt and the static, a protector who'd turned his own tragedy into a lifeline for others. And Marcus, alive because of a voice from beyond, drove on, carrying the weight of gratitude and the quiet hope that someone, or something, was still watching over the lonely highways. Story number 4. I gripped the steering wheel of my rig. The world outside swallowed by a blizzard's fury. Snow lashed the windshield, turning the highway into a tunnel of white chaos. My headlights barely pierced the storm, illuminating only a few feet of icy road. 9 years hauling freight across the country, and I'd never seen a night this brutal. Something felt wrong, like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. The dashboard clock glowed faintly. But time didn't matter out here. Highway 2 in North Dakota was a desolate stretch, flanked by endless plains that howled with wind. I'd slowed to a crawl, my 60,000-pound truck swaying against the gusts. My instincts screamed to pull over, to wait out the storm, but stopping felt like surrendering to whatever was lurking in the dark.
That's when I saw her. A lone figure stood by the roadside, barely visible through the snow. She wasn't waving, wasn't moving, just standing there. A shadow in the storm. My heart thudded. Every trucker knows the rule. Don't stop for strangers. But as my headlights swept over her, I saw a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, dressed in jeans and a thin jacket. No hat, no gloves, nothing to shield her from the sub-zero cold. She looked like she'd freeze to death in minutes.
I kept driving, my hands trembling. My company's policy was clear: no hitchhikers, ever. But the image of that girl burned into my mind. What kind of person leaves someone to die in a blizzard? I wrestled with my conscience. The wind screaming outside like it was urging me to keep going, but I couldn't. I pulled over, 50 yards past her, the truck's engine rumbling as I sat there, debating. The temperature gauge read -20, with a wind chill that could kill in minutes. I couldn't just leave her. I put the truck in reverse, backed up, and rolled down the passenger window. "Hey, do you need help?" I called out. "It's dangerous to be out in this weather." The girl looked up, her face pale, her lips tinged blue. She nodded. And something in her eyes, gratitude, or maybe something else, made my skin prickle. The girl looked up at Angela with what appeared to be genuine relief and gratitude. She was young, blonde, and pretty, but her lips were already blue from the cold, and she was shivering uncontrollably. "My car broke down about a mile back," she said, her voice faint over the wind. "I've been walking for almost an hour trying to find help. Could you give me a ride to the next town? I can pay you." I hesitated, my gut twisting, but I unlocked the passenger door. She climbed in, bringing a wave of cold air and a strange, sweet scent, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. She introduced herself as Jennifer, explaining that her car had slid into a ditch, her phone was dead, and the storm was worsening. Angela felt sorry for her and was glad she had decided to help. Jennifer seemed polite and grateful, and she promised she would only need a ride as far as the next truck stop, where she could call someone to pick her up. I nodded, trying to focus on the road, but something about her felt off. Her hands stayed folded in her lap, unmoving, and her shivering didn't stop, even with the heater roaring. As we drove, I tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "Where are you from?" I asked. "Round here," she replied, her voice flat. When I pressed for details, she couldn't name a single town or landmark. I asked about her family, and she mumbled something about visiting relatives but couldn't recall their names at all. When Angela asked about her family, Jennifer said she had been visiting relatives. but she couldn't remember their names or exactly where they lived. My unease grew. The cab was warm now, but Jennifer's lips stayed blue, her skin ice cold when I handed her a blanket from the sleeper berth. I glanced at her, and my stomach churned. She wasn't warming up. Her chest didn't rise or fall with breath. No vapor clouded the air when she spoke. Despite the freezing temperature, even with the truck's heater running at full blast, Jennifer continued to shiver and her lips remained blue. I gripped the wheel tighter, my mind racing. Was she sick, hypothermic, or was she something else entirely? About 20 miles down the road, I noticed headlights in my side mirror. Another vehicle, tailing us at a steady distance. I slowed down, and it slowed. I sped up slightly, and it matched my pace. When Angela slowed down, the trailing vehicle slowed down. When Angela sped up slightly, it matched her pace. My years on the road had taught me to trust my instincts, and this felt like a setup. I decided to test her. I need to stop at a way station up ahead to check my load, I said casually. Jennifer's reaction was instant. Her eyes widened, and she leaned toward me. No, we can't stop. It's too dangerous in this storm. Her voice had an edge, sharp and desperate. I explained it would only take a few minutes, but she grabbed my arm with a grip that felt like iron. Jennifer grabbed Angela's arm with surprising strength and said, "No, we can't stop. They're waiting for us to stop." "Who's they?" I demanded, but she just stared out the window, muttering about needing to keep moving. My heart pounded. I looked at her again, and this time I saw it. Her chest wasn't moving. No breath, no life. And when Angela looked closely, she realized that Jennifer wasn't breathing at all. The realization hit me like a freight train. Whatever was sitting beside me wasn't human. It was wearing Jennifer's face, using her voice, but it wasn't her. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep driving, while my mind scrambled for a plan. The truck stop was only a few miles away, a beacon of light in the storm, and I decided that was my best chance. Angela decided to make her move at the truck stop, where there might be other people and security cameras. But as we got closer, Jennifer grew frantic, her eyes darting to the mirrors. "They're catching up," she whispered, her voice no longer soft but guttural. "Unnatural." Then she turned to me and her face changed. Her eyes were black voids, her smile revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "You know what I am, don't you?" Jennifer said in a voice that was no longer quite human. "I can smell your fear. It's delicious." I swallowed hard, my blood turning to ice. "Just a quick stop," I said, keeping my voice steady. She laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. Jennifer continued talking, and what she said next explained everything. "We've been hunting this highway for 3 winters now. I stand in the cold to attract the sympathetic ones, the drivers who can't resist helping someone in distress. We wait for you to stop somewhere quiet," she continued, her voice dripping with malice. "Then my friends take what they want. Your truck, your cargo, sometimes more." I realized the headlights behind us belonged to her accomplices, but she'd let slip a crucial detail. Usually we let the drivers go afterward. But lately, we've been getting hungrier. Some drivers survived. That meant I had a chance. I kept driving toward the truck stop, ignoring her increasingly desperate demands to turn back. The lights of the station grew brighter, and I could see other trucks parked in the lot. Safety was close. Angela pulled up directly in front of the truck stop's main entrance and immediately began honking her horn repeatedly. I slammed my hand on the horn, the sound cutting through the storm. Jennifer's face twisted into something monstrous. "You'll regret this," she hissed, but I noticed she hadn't touched the door handle or any controls. Jennifer hadn't touched the door handle since getting into the truck, and she seemed unable to operate any of the truck's controls. It was like she was bound by rules, unable to act here. People poured out of the truck stop, truckers, employees, all drawn by the noise. I pointed at Jennifer and shouted, "This isn't human. She's been trying to lure me into a trap." She let out a sound that shattered the cab's windows, then vanished. leaving nothing but a fading wisp of that sickly sweet smell. The temperature in the cab immediately returned to normal, and the sweet, cloying smell that had been bothering Angela dissipated instantly. The other truckers crowded around, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief. I called the police, my hands still shaking. When they arrived, they checked the security footage. The cameras clearly showed Angela's truck pulling up and Angela getting out, but they showed no passenger in the truck at any point. I was alone the whole time, according to the tape, but I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt. The police searched the area and found a car in a ditch a mile back. Just as Jennifer had described, there was indeed a car in a ditch about a mile from where Angela had picked up Jennifer. But it had been there for over 6 months. It belonged to Jennifer Walsh, a college student who died in a blizzard the previous winter. Her body frozen in that same thin jacket. The car was registered to a Jennifer Walsh, a 22-year-old college student who had disappeared during a blizzard the previous winter. The officers told me I wasn't the first. The police confirmed that Angela was the 4th trucker in 2 years to report picking up a hitchhiker matching Jennifer's description on that same stretch of highway during winter storms. Others had escaped by stopping in public places, but some hadn't been so lucky. 2 other truckers had disappeared completely on that highway during the same time period, their trucks found abandoned with no trace of the drivers. I dug deeper, unable to let it go. Jennifer Walsh had been driving to visit relatives when her car went off the road during a blizzard, but the detail that haunts me most is this. Jennifer Walsh had been driving westbound when she crashed, but the hitchhiker, claiming to be Jennifer, had been standing on the eastbound side of the highway as if trying to lead me back to where she'd died. That night changed me. I still drive Highway 2, but never in winter. I've installed cameras inside and outside my truck, and I'm part of a network of drivers who share warnings about that stretch of road. Angela still drives that route occasionally, but never during winter storms. And she's installed additional security cameras in her truck that record both the interior and exterior. I've never picked up another hitchhiker, no matter how desperate they seem, but the memory of Jennifer lingers, sometimes, late at night. I catch a whiff of that sweet, rotting scent in the cab. I check my mirrors, half expecting to see those black eyes staring back. The plains of North Dakota hold secrets, and I've learned they don't let go easily. The storm had passed by morning, but the chill in my bones remained. Stayed at the truck stop for hours, talking to other drivers who'd heard similar stories. One old-timer, a grizzled man named Hank, told me about the winter wraiths of Highway 2, spirits of those who died in blizzards, cursed to wander the road forever. He said they prey on kindness, exploiting the instinct to help. His story matched mine too closely for comfort. I started researching the highway's history, and North Dakota's winters are brutal, claiming lives every year. But Highway 2 was different. Angela learned that Highway 2 through North Dakota has one of the highest rates of missing trucker cases in the country, with over a dozen drivers vanishing without explanation in the past 5 years. The locals whispered about a cult, or maybe something older, using the storms as cover to hunt. No one had proof, but the pattern was undeniable. I kept driving, but I changed my routes. The open road used to feel like freedom, now it feels like a trap waiting to spring. I carry a journal now, writing down every detail of that night to make sure I don't forget. The other truckers in my network report strange sightings too. Figures in the snow, headlights that follow too closely. We've started calling it the Phantom's Run. One night, months later, I stopped at a diner off Highway 2. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, overheard me talking about Jennifer. She leaned in and whispered, "You're lucky you stopped when you did. That road takes more than it gives." She told me about a legend, a girl who died in a crash, bound to the highway by a deal with something dark. The girl lures drivers, but she's not the real threat. Whatever follows her is... I don't know what's out there, but I know it's real. The police reports, the missing drivers, the car in the ditch, It all adds up to something I can't explain. Local law enforcement believes that there's an organized group using supernatural bait to lure truckers into isolated areas, but they've never been able to catch the perpetrators or determine exactly how they're operating. I keep driving, but I'm always watching, always listening. The road has a way of teaching you to stay sharp or pay the price. Story number 5. I've driven trucks for 15 years, through deserts and mountains, but no road ever scared me like that one. It was a job that sounded simple, too simple. A single container, a short route, and a paycheck that could have bought me a new life. But the moment I got the call, something felt off, like a shadow creeping over my shoulder. The dispatcher's voice was clipped, urgent, and he wouldn't answer my questions. The warehouse was a fortress, hidden in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by razor wire and men who moved like soldiers. They didn't look at me, didn't speak, just handed me papers to sign and pointed to the container. It was heavy, cold, and wrong, like it was alive. Waiting, I'd hauled plenty of cargo, but this one felt like it was hauling me. The highway stretched out under a sky black as coal, and I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. Not by the stars, not by passing cars, but by something inside that container. Every mile, my unease grew, like a knot tightening in my gut. What was I carrying? Weapons? Drugs? Something worse? Then I heard it. A sound from the trailer. Soft but deliberate, like fingers brushing against metal. It wasn't the road, wasn't the wind. It was alive, moving, thinking. My hands gripped the wheel until my knuckles turned white. I told myself it was nothing, but the sound kept coming, growing louder, more insistent, like it wanted me to know it was there. I stopped at a gas station, the kind where the lights flicker and the air feels heavy. I checked the trailer, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and saw marks, deep scratches, like claws had raked the metal from the inside. My heart pounded so hard I thought it had burst. Whatever was in that container, it wasn't supposed to be there. And it wanted out. My name's Carl Matthews, and I had been driving cross-country for 15 years and prided myself on being professional and reliable. I'd hauled everything from livestock to classified gear, always on time, always by the book. That's why I was chosen for what seemed like a routine but high-paying job. A single container from a warehouse outside Memphis to a facility in Colorado. The pay was exceptional, almost 3 times my normal rate, with strict rules. Don't open the container, don't stop for long, don't talk about it. The pickup was at an isolated warehouse complex about 30 miles outside of Memphis, surrounded by high fences and security cameras. It looked like a military base, not a shipping yard. Men in dark suits checked my identification multiple times, their faces blank as they handed me confidentiality agreements to sign. They moved with a precision that made my skin crawl, like they were guarding something bigger than cargo. The container was a standard 20-footer, but heavily modified with additional locks, reinforcement plates, and what appeared to be some kind of ventilation system. It had temperature monitoring equipment and what looked like motion sensors on the outside, blinking faintly in the dark. The men loaded it with strange equipment, checking every strap twice, and they gave me a sealed envelope containing delivery instructions to be opened 50 miles out. I'd hauled secret cargo before, but this felt different, like I was stepping into a trap.
I hit the highway. The container, a silent weight behind me. The first few hours were uneventful. The road clear under a fading sun, but as night fell, I heard it at first. I attributed the noises to normal road vibration, but these were different. Steady, rhythmic, like something pacing inside the container. I turned off the radio, my ears straining. The sounds grew sharper, scraping, clawing, alive.
I tried to focus on the road, but my mind was racing. Was it machinery? An animal? The shipping papers said research materials but this felt wrong. By nightfall, the noises were constant, coming from the front of the trailer. The sound seemed deliberate and rhythmic, like something with a purpose. I pulled into a Kansas truck stop to refuel. My nerves frayed. As I checked the trailer, I saw it. There were small droplets of what appeared to be blood seeping from the bottom seal of the container, pooling in the dirt below. My stomach dropped. I wanted to call my dispatcher, but the confidentiality agreement specifically prohibited me from contacting anyone unless it was an emergency, and I wasn't sure this qualified. The container looked secure, no visible damage, just those dark, glistening drops. I got back in the cab, my hands shaking, and kept driving. The night felt heavier now, like the air itself was pressing against me. The noises didn't stop. The scratching would continue for several minutes, then stop completely, then resume with more intensity. It was worse when I braked or turned. The scratching would become more frantic, like whatever was inside could feel the truck move. I kept my CB radio on, hoping for a distraction, but the airwaves were dead. My phone was ready. But who could I call? I was alone. Just me and whatever was in that trailer. Somewhere in Colorado, on a stretch of highway, flanked by nothing but darkness. Things escalated. My truck's motion sensors began registering movement on the trailer, not just vibrations, but something heavy, maybe 200 pounds. Shifting inside, my truck system was designed to catch load shifts, and it was going crazy. I pulled into a rest area, my heart pounding. The moment I stopped, the noises stopped too, dead silence. I grabbed my flashlight and circled the trailer. That's when I saw them, human handprints pressed against the metal from the inside. So forceful they dented the steel. They were at eye level, smeared with what looked like sweat or tears. My breath caught in my throat. Something, or someone, was trying to escape. I dialed the emergency number I'd been given. No answer. My dispatcher's line was dead too, just a robotic voice saying it was out of service. Then I heard it, a voice, faint and desperate, from inside the container. "Help me," it said. "I don't know where I am," I shouted back, asking how many were inside. The reply was chilling. "There are 3 of us left. There were more, but they didn't make it." My mind reeled. Was I hauling people? Kidnapped? Trapped? Dying? I called 911, gave my location, and waited, my hands trembling. The police arrived with a hazmat team. They pried open the container, and what they found defied logic. The container was completely empty, except for a climate control system and medical monitors. No people, no bodies, just personal belongings, food wrappers, and what appeared to be makeshift bedding. But the monitors were active, showing heart rates, breathing, brain activity for 3 distinct individuals, alive and conscious, in a container that held no one. The investigation went nowhere. The warehouse was abandoned, the documents forged, the serial numbers were fake, and the men in suits had vanished. I was cleared of any wrongdoing, but the questions haunted me. What had I been carrying? Months later, a package arrived at my house. No return address. Inside was a USB drive with video footage from the container showing 3 people, 2 men, 1 woman, begging for help, calling my name. The timestamps matched when the police found the container empty. I turned the drive over to the FBI, but they had no answers. I quit long-haul trucking after that, sticking to local runs where I can see my cargo. But some nights, I hear that voice, pleading from the dark. The FBI says other truckers have reported similar jobs, sealed containers, high pay, no questions. Whatever I stumbled into, it's still out there, moving through the shadows of the highway. Story number 6. I'd been hauling cargo across this country for over a decade, and I thought I'd seen it all. blizzard-blocked highways, ghost towns swallowed by dust, and diners with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. But nothing prepared me for the night I stumbled into a place that wasn't supposed to exist. It was late. The kind of late where the world feels like it's holding its breath. And I was bone tired. My rig rattling down a lonely stretch of Interstate 70. The signs glowed out of the darkness like a beacon, promising fuel, food, and rest at a place called Big Jim's Plaza. Something about those signs felt off, like they were too bright, too perfect. But my tank was low, and my eyelids were heavier than my load. So I turned off the highway and into the unknown. And into the surf. I pulled into what appeared to be a new facility on Interstate 70 in Missouri. The lot was massive, lit up like a stadium, with rows of rigs parked in neat lines. The truck stop appeared completely normal from the highway, its neon signs buzzing with promises of cheap diesel and hot meals. I eased my rig into the fuel island. The hum of the pump, a familiar comfort. But as I filled my tank, I noticed the price, way lower than anywhere else I'd stopped that week. The diesel price was significantly lower than what I had been seeing at other stops. I mentioned it to the attendant, a wiry guy with a smile that didn't quite match his eyes. "We like to keep folks coming back," he said, his voice smooth as oil. I nodded. But a prickle ran down my neck, like I'd just stepped into a trap. I couldn't see. The air in the lot felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on my shoulders. Other drivers moved through the shadows, but they weren't talking, weren't joking. No rough laughter or CB chatter spilling from open cabs. I saw a man standing by his rig, staring at nothing. His eyes like empty sockets in the sodium lights. The main building loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting my own tired face back at me. I pushed inside, expecting the usual truck stop buzz, but the silence hit me like a wall, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The interior of the truck stop was impressive, clean, well-stocked, and modern. Shelves were packed with snacks, drinks, and gear, all neatly arranged. The restaurant section was open, serving steaming plates of food despite the hour. There were quite a few other truckers inside, but they were quiet, too quiet. Some sat at tables, forks frozen mid-bite. Others wandered the aisles like ghosts, their movements slow and mechanical. I grabbed a coffee and some jerky, trying to shake the unease. At the checkout counter, a friendly, middle-aged woman rang up my purchases. "You staying with us tonight?" she asked. Her smile too wide, her eyes too sharp. "We have excellent sleeping facilities, and many of our customers find that once they rest here, they don't want to leave." I shook my head, muttering something about sleeping in my rig. Her smile didn't falter, but her words lingered like a bad smell. That's what they all say at first. I hurried out, the weight of her gaze boring into my back. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed the other drivers in the lot. They were moving very slowly and deliberately, their steps heavy, like they were wading through molasses. One guy stood by his trailer, staring into the distance, his face blank as a mannequin's. I climbed into my cab, eager to hit the road, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The dashboard lit up, the radio crackled, but the engine was dead as a doornail. My rig had been running fine for years, not a single hiccup. And now it wouldn't even cough. Panic crept in, cold and sharp, as I tried the key again and again. The lot outside seemed to close in, the other trucks looming like silent sentinels. I went back inside to ask if there was a mechanic on duty. The clerk looked at me like she'd been expecting me. "Engines act up sometimes around here," she said, her tone too casual. "Try Jim. He's in the restaurant." The clerk directed me to a man named Jim, a big guy with a friendly grin, sitting alone with a coffee. He followed me out, tinkering under the hood for a few minutes. He claimed to have found the problem, a loose electrical connection. My rig roared to life, and I thanked him. But his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come back anytime," he said, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. I prepared to leave, but something made me check my rig one last time. That's when I saw it. A small, metallic device wired into the engine compartment, glowing faintly with a red light. I froze. Every single truck in the parking lot had the same modification. I checked another rig, then another. Each one had the same device, tucked away like a parasite. My hands shook as I ripped the thing off my engine and tossed it into a dumpster. I quickly left the parking lot without looking back. The highway stretched out before me, dark and empty, but as I glanced in my mirrors, I saw them, several rigs pulling out behind me, their headlights cutting through the night like eyes. A convoy of trucks stayed behind me, keeping pace no matter how fast I drove. I grabbed my CB radio, desperate for help, but the voices that came through were wrong, flat, lifeless, chanting, "You can't leave Big Jim's and come back to the plaza where you belong." I floored the gas, my heart pounding like a drum. The convoy followed, relentless, their engines roaring in unison like a pack of wolves. I took a sharp exit, weaving through back roads, my rig groaning under the strain. The headlights faded, but the fear didn't. I knew I wasn't out of this yet. By dawn, I reached a familiar truck stop, one I knew was real, and called the cops, and I tried to provide the location of Big Jim's 24-hour plaza. But my GPS showed nothing, just an empty lot where the exit should have been. The police were skeptical until I showed them the device I'd kept in my pocket. The device turned out to be a sophisticated tracking and control system, far beyond anything they'd seen. They sent a team to check the site, but all they found was cracked concrete and weeds. The ghost of a truck stop, long gone. The cops dug deeper, and what they found turned my blood cold. Local records showed that a facility called Big Jim's Plaza had operated at that location in the 1980s and 1990s. It shut down after the owner, James Morrison, died in a crash caused by a strange electronic system that failed his brakes. The technology was similar in design to the device that Rebecca found attached to her own truck. I started asking around, talking to other drivers, and the stories piled up. Over the past 15 years, Missouri State Police had received at least 8 similar reports from truckers, drivers who'd stopped at Big Jim's, had engine trouble, met a guy named Jim, and found those damn devices on their rigs. Some never made it out. 3 truckers who had reported stopping at the Phantom truck stop had subsequently disappeared. Their rigs were found abandoned, empty, along the highway. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd escaped something bigger, something that wasn't done with me. Months later, a postcard arrived at my home, showing a pristine Big Jim's Plaza under a blood-red sky. The message read, "We miss you at Big Jim's. Your sleeping room is still available whenever you're ready to come home." It was postmarked from a Missouri town, but the post office swore they'd never processed it. My GPS started acting up, too, trying to route me back to that empty lot. Even when I was states away, I shared my story with other truckers through online forums, and the pattern was clear. Others had gotten the same postcards, the same eerie calls to return. Some said their rigs would stall on that stretch of highway, their engines cutting out for no reason. I changed my routes, avoiding Missouri like it was cursed. I've installed multiple backup GPS systems and carry paper maps. I joined a group of drivers who swap stories about weird stops, strange devices, and roads that don't exist. I've learned to trust my instincts completely. If something feels off, I don't care how bright the lights are or how cheap the fuel is, I'm gone. But the memory of Big Jim's lingers, like a shadow in my rearview mirror. I dug into the history of James Morrison, the man behind the name, according to newspaper accounts. Morrison died when his truck's brakes failed, crashing into a bridge. The report mentioned an experimental system, eerily like the one I'd found. I keep that device locked in a box, a reminder of how close I came to whatever Big Jim's really is.
Every mile I drive, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. Some nights, I hear static on my CB2, and a voice, low, lifeless, whispers my name. I check my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights trailing me again. A Big Jim's isn't just a truck stop, it's a trap, a machine that doesn't let go. And somewhere, out there on Interstate 70, I know it's still calling, waiting for the next driver to pull in.
Story number 7. I've been driving trucks for 13 years, hauling everything from fine art to rare antiques across this great country. Those high-value loads paid better than standard freight, and I prided myself on handling them with care. But some jobs, they don't just pay in dollars, they take something from you, something you can't get back. In November 2020, I took a contract that changed me forever. And I'm here to tell you why I'll never touch certain cargo again. It started with a phone call, one that woke me in the dead of night. The voice on the other end was soft, almost too soft, like it was coming from underwater. A man named Harrison Blackwood needed a driver to move antique furniture from Savannah, Georgia, to a collector in Portland, Oregon. The payout was triple my usual rate, so I didn't ask too many questions. I should have when I arrived at the pickup. The mansion loomed like a forgotten giant, its windows dark and gardens choked with weeds. It was a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Savannah that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on my chest, and the sunlight didn't seem to touch the house the way it should. Blackwood met me at the door, pale as a ghost, his eyes sunken and his voice barely above a whisper. He was extremely pale, soft-spoken, and insistent that the furniture be loaded in a very specific order, with the armoire placed at the very front of the trailer. The loading took hours, and not because of the weight. Blackwood hovered over every piece, muttering about their history, his hands trembling as he pointed to a massive armoire. The armoire that Blackwood had mentioned was particularly unsettling. It was a massive piece, nearly 8 feet tall and made of dark wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The carvings on it, angels and demons twisting together, made my skin crawl. What made James uncomfortable was that the carved figures seemed to change depending on the angle from which you viewed them. They seemed to watch me, their eyes shifting from serene to sinister as I moved. Blackwood's warning was clear. Under no circumstances should you open this piece or allow anyone else to examine it. The lock is there for everyone's protection. I hit the road at dusk, planning to drive through the night. The first few hours were quiet, but as the stars came out, I felt a chill that wasn't from the weather. The furniture pieces were reportedly from the 1800s and included several bedroom sets, dining room furniture, and what Blackwood described as a very special armoire that's been in my family for generations. But something was off. What struck James as unusual was how cold the furniture felt. It was like touching ice. Even though the Georgia heat was thick and heavy, I shook it off, focused on the road, but then the noises started. Not the usual hum of a long haul. These were deliberate, like footsteps pacing in the trailer. I told myself it was just the load settling, but deep down, I knew better. By midnight, I couldn't ignore it. I pulled into a rest area, my heart pounding. Several of the smaller furniture pieces had moved from their original positions despite being properly tied down with heavy-duty straps. Worse, the armoire's lock was hanging open, though I'd swear on my life it was secure when we loaded it. The massive piece remained in its original position, but the lock that Blackwood had been so concerned about was now hanging open. I stepped closer, and the carvings seemed to move. their faces twisting into something hungry. I didn't dare touch the door. I tightened the straps and got back in the cab. But the trailer felt alive, like it was watching me through the rearview mirror. The journey west was a descent into something I can't fully explain. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was on that armoire. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a presence. The air in the cab grew colder, my breath fogging despite the mild night. Then came the voices. Muffled at first, like whispers from a dream. They grew clearer, calling my name. James began to hear what sounded like voices, muffled conversations coming from inside the armoire, as if multiple people were trapped inside and trying to communicate with each other. They weren't just random pleas, they knew things. My wife's name, Sarah, the color of my living room walls, the route I always took through Tennessee to avoid traffic. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white, telling myself it was exhaustion playing tricks. In Arkansas, around 3 a.m., something broke my resolve. From his trailer came the unmistakable sound of a woman screaming. It wasn't quick, it lingered, raw and desperate, like someone was being torn apart inside that armoire. I slammed on the brakes, pulled over, and sat there. Heart hammering, the trailer went silent. But the silence was worse. James called the number that Blackwood had given him for emergencies. But the phone was disconnected. I tried the auction house in Portland. They had never heard of Harrison Blackwood or any furniture delivery scheduled from Georgia. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with a trailer full of something I didn't understand. The armoire wasn't just cargo, it was a trap. The armoire, which was positioned near the front of his trailer, where he could see it through his rear window, appeared to be rocking back and forth slightly. It moved like something inside was testing the walls, looking for a way out. The temperature dropped further, my dashboard flickering like it was possessed. Then, clear as day, a voice called my name. James, please help us. We've been trapped in here for so long. Please open the door and let us out. A young woman's voice, trembling with fear. I ignored it, kept driving, but the voices multiplied. Men, women, children, all begging. They claimed to have been trapped for decades, some for over a century, and they described the interior of the armoire as a place of endless darkness and cold. By Oklahoma, I was fraying at the edges, The voices turned cruel, promising to follow me home, to haunt Sarah and our kids. They mentioned his wife by name, described his house, and knew about his trucking route preferences. My radio spat static. My GPS showed places that don't exist, and my engine stuttered like it was choking. I pulled into a truck stop in Oklahoma City, desperate for help. Other drivers kept their distance, saying they felt the cold radiating from my trailer. Several drivers approached him to ask if everything was all right, explaining that they could hear screaming coming from his trailer and that the temperature around his truck was noticeably colder than the surrounding area. When the police arrived, they opened the trailer and found something impossible. Every piece of furniture had moved from its secured position and was now arranged in a perfect circle around the armoire, as if the pieces had repositioned themselves during transport. The armoire's door was wide open, revealing an interior that seemed to stretch far beyond its frame. Inside the armoire, police found dozens of personal items, jewelry, photographs, clothing, and identification documents dating back to the 1800s. They belonged to people long gone, missing since the 19th century, preserved like they'd been frozen in time. All of the items belonged to people who had been reported missing over the past 150 years. The investigation unraveled more questions than answers. Police contacted authorities in Savannah to investigate Harrison Blackwood and the Victorian mansion where James had picked up the furniture. The mansion had been empty since 1987, when Harrison Blackwood Sr. vanished. The current owner was a property management company that had been trying to sell the house for decades, but had been unable to find buyers due to reports of paranormal activity. The armoire had a grim history, tied to disappearances since the 1850s. Historical records showed that the piece had belonged to a wealthy Savannah family in the 1850s and that over a dozen people had vanished while the armoire was in their possession. I was cleared of any wrongdoing, the cargo wasn't what it seemed, and I'd been played. The furniture was taken into evidence and eventually transferred to a team of paranormal investigators who specialized in haunted objects. They burned it all in a controlled fire, but the flames burned blue, unnatural, and voices echoed until the last splinter was ash. The armoire and the other pieces were eventually destroyed in a controlled burn, but witnesses reported that the fire burned with an unusual blue flame. I quit long-haul trucking after that. James retired from long-haul trucking immediately after the incident and now works for a local delivery company that only handles verified cargo with full documentation. I stick to local routes, checking every load like my life depends on it. He's also become an advocate for truckers' safety and frequently speaks about the importance of verifying the legitimacy of shippers and cargo before accepting unusual or high-paying loads. But the story didn't end there. Police were never able to locate him or determine his real identity. Security footage showed me loading the furniture alone, talking to thin air. Security cameras at the Savannah mansion showed James arriving for the pickup, but they showed no other person on the property at any time. 6 months later, a package arrived. James received a package in the mail containing a small wooden figurine carved in the same style as the decorations on the armoire. It looked like me, down to the scar on my chin. The note read, "Thank you for your service. The collection continues to grow, and we always need reliable transportation." No return address, just a Savannah postmark that didn't exist in any postal records. I locked the figurine in a safe deposit box, but the calls still come. James keeps the figurine locked in a safe deposit box at his bank, but he reports that he occasionally receives phone calls late at night from people claiming to be trapped and needing transportation to join the collection. Always from Savannah numbers, always disconnected when I call back. I don't sleep much anymore. Not when I know the collection is still out there, waiting for its next driver. Story number 8. My name is Patricia Williams, and for 16 years, I've hauled freight across this country, known for delivering any load on time, no matter the weather, traffic, or mechanical gremlins trying to throw me off. I've seen the open road in every shade of dawn and dusk, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that March night in 2022. I was just a trucker, living for the hum of the engine and the promise of a paycheck, until a single delivery turned my understanding of reality inside out. This is my story, and if you're listening, hold tight, because it's going to twist your mind like a desert highway mirage. I thought time was a straight line, a road that always led somewhere. I was wrong. The night started like any other, with the glow of my dashboard and the rhythm of tires on asphalt. I'd just picked up a load from a sleek pharmaceutical plant outside Columbus, Ohio, bound for a research hospital in Nevada. The cargo was medical equipment, sensitive stuff that needed precise climate control, and the shipper was paying top dollar for a tight deadline. I didn't ask questions. Never do when the money's good. The crates were loaded by techs in hazmat suits, their faces unreadable behind visors. They gave me strict instructions. Keep the trailer at 38 degrees Fahrenheit, no sudden stops, no sharp turns. I nodded, checked the seals, and hit the road, planning to barrel through on Interstate 70 with just enough stops to keep the feds off my back. 3 days to deliver, and I was already ahead of schedule. But something felt off from the start. The air was too still, the sky too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I shook it off, chalking it up to a long day. But as I crossed into Illinois, the unease grew. It was around 10 p.m. when I hit a stretch of I-70 near Effingham, a flat, boring ribbon of highway I'd driven 100 times. No landmarks, just farmland and mile markers ticking by like a heartbeat. I glanced at my logbook, noting mile marker 159, and kept rolling at a steady 65 mph. 10 minutes later, I saw it again, mile marker 159. I blinked, thinking I'd misread it, kept driving, 5 minutes more. And there it was, 159 again, staring at me like a bad dream. I pulled over, heart pounding, and checked my GPS. All 3 units, redundant systems I'd installed for reliability, showed me at mile marker 159, moving westbound at highway speed. But I wasn't moving, not really. The screens said I was cruising, but the world outside my windshield was frozen in place. Same red barn with a missing board, same twisted dead tree, same faded billboard for a diner I'd never stopped at. I tried my phone. No signal. CB radio? Static. Satellite comms? Dead. I was alone, cut off, trapped in a single mile of nowhere. Panic crept in, but I'm no rookie. I did a self-check. Vision, coordination, mental clarity, all normal. No stroke, no seizure. My truck was fine too. Gauges steady, engine purring. So why was I stuck? I drove on, thinking it had sort itself out. An hour later, I was still passing that cursed mile marker 159 every few minutes like clockwork. The landscape didn't change, not a blade of grass out of place. I tried everything, speeding up, slowing down, even veering onto the shoulder. Nothing broke the cycle. It was like the highway had folded in on itself, and I was driving in a circle that didn't exist. The realization hit me harder than a blown tire. I was trapped in a loop, not just of road, but of time itself. The same farmhouses, the same grove of trees, the same rusted plough in a field. They were identical every time I passed. I started timing it, 4 minutes, 37 seconds, from 159 to 159, no matter how fast I drove. My fuel gauge didn't budge. Stuck at 3/4 full. My odometer? Frozen. I wasn't aging either. Not a hint of fatigue despite hours behind the wheel. This wasn't just a glitch. It was unnatural, like I'd slipped into a crack in reality. Then I noticed the cargo. The temperature monitors in my trailer started flickering, showing impossible spikes and drops. I checked the cargo bay, and my blood ran cold. The crates were glowing, a faint blue pulse that hadn't been there when they were loaded. No mention of this in the shipping docks. Just diagnostic equipment worth $2 million. The glow pulsed in sync with a low vibration I could feel in my bones, thrumming through the truck's frame. I tried the emergency contact number for the pharmaceutical company. Nothing. Dead air. Whatever I was hauling, it wasn't just medical gear. I kept driving, desperate to break free. I tried off-ramps but they curved back to 159. I drove in reverse. Same highway, same marker. I even crossed the median only to find myself still heading west. The loop was airtight, a prison of asphalt and time. That's when I heard him. A voice crackled through my CB radio, faint but clear. "This is Bobby," it said, "and you're not alone." Bobby was another trucker, trapped like me. His voice heavy with years of resignation. He said he'd been stuck for what felt like years, hauling cargo for the same company. He called it a temporal distortion field. Some kind of experiment using drivers like us as guinea pigs. Bobby's words chilled me. He claimed dozens of us were trapped across the country, each in our own pocket of time, hauling tech that bent reality itself. The company wasn't making medicine, they were playing with time. Bobby had given up, but I refused. I tore through my truck, searching for answers. The crates glowed brighter now, the vibrations stronger, like a heartbeat from something alive. I found a small device wired into my truck's computer, a black box the company had installed to monitor the cargo. It was the key. I yanked the wires and the world shuddered. The glow dimmed. The vibration stopped. And the highway changed. The barn was weathered now. The tree half collapsed. The billboard faded to illegibility. My GPS flickered back on, showing 3 weeks had passed. 3 weeks. I'd been gone for hours in my mind, but the world had moved on. I called the authorities, but the pharmaceutical company was gone. Empty facility, fake documents. The crates were empty too, as if the equipment had never existed. I'm back on the road now, but I'm not the same. I can feel time now, its ripples and cracks, like a sixth sense I never asked for. I've joined a network of drivers sharing warnings about shady shipments. Bobby's voice still comes through my CB sometimes, late at night, begging for rescue. I don't know if he's real or a ghost in the loop. My truck? It aged years in those 3 weeks. Worn tires, rusted parts, like it lived a lifetime while I was untouched. The road doesn't scare me anymore, but the cargo does, and somewhere out there, that company is still running its experiments, waiting for the next driver to fall into their trap. I thought escaping the loop would be the end, but it was just the beginning. The world I returned to felt wrong, like a photograph left in the sun too long. The authorities didn't believe me at first. I told them about mile marker 159, the glowing crates, Bobby's voice. But their eyes glazed over, like I was reciting a fever dream. The FBI had 17 similar reports over 5 years, all from truckers hauling for companies that vanished. Each driver lost days or weeks. Their trucks aged unnaturally, their memories sharper than they should be. No one had answers, only questions. I went back to Ohio, to the facility where I'd picked up the load. It was a ghost town, empty warehouses, broken windows, no trace of the techs in hazmat suits. The locals said the place had been abandoned for years, which didn't add up. I'd been there days ago, or so I thought. Time was playing tricks on me. Even now, I started digging, talking to other drivers, piecing together whispers from the road. We formed a network, a secret club of survivors, trading stories about shipments that felt off, strange instructions, unmarked crates, companies with no paper trail. The more I learned, the worse it got. Bobby wasn't the only voice on the CB. Others came through. Sarah, Miguel, a guy who just called himself Hawk, each trapped in their own loop, their voices fading in and out like bad reception. They described the same symptoms, repeating landscapes, frozen time, cargo that didn't behave. Some had been stuck for months, others claimed years. One driver, Anna, said she saw shadows moving in her loop, human shapes that weren't there when she looked directly. I started seeing them too, flickering at the edge of my vision, like ghosts pacing the highway. My truck became my obsession. The engine showed wear equivalent to years of driving, despite my logs showing a single trip. I tore it apart, looking for more of those black boxes, but found nothing. But the damage was done. The tires were bald, the frame creaked like it was ready to retire. I couldn't shake the feeling that the truck remembered the loop better than I did, because I got it fixed, but I kept the old parts, rusted bolts, cracked hoses, as proof. Proof for who? I don't know. Maybe for me. I started noticing patterns. Certain routes, certain cargoes, certain companies, they all led to the same kind of trouble. I learned to spot the warning signs, vague manifests, over-the-top security, clients who paid too much for simple runs. I turned down a job last month because the shipper wouldn't tell me what was in the crates. Felt like the right call when I heard another driver got stuck on I-80 with a load from the same company. He's still out there, somewhere, circling a mile marker in Nebraska. I don't sleep much anymore. Not because I'm tired. I'm not. Not really. My body hasn't aged right since the loop. Doctors ran every test. Blood work, MRIs, psych evals. Nothing. Physically. I'm fine. But I can feel time differently now. It's like a river, and I can see the currents, the eddies where things don't flow right. I've driven past places, empty lots, old warehouses, and felt a pull, like the air was too thick, and I think they're testing grounds, places where the experiments are still running. I tracked down one of the FBI agents who took my report. A guy named Carter. He was cagey, but he let slip that the Bureau's been chasing this for years. They think it's a shadow operation, not one company, but a network, using shell corporations to hide their tracks. Carter said the tech is beyond anything the government's seen. Time manipulation, quantum something or other. He didn't have details, just a warning to stay out of it. Like hell I will. I've been mapping the loops. Every driver I talk to, every story I hear, I mark it on a map. I-70 in Illinois, I-80 in Nebraska, I-95 in Florida. They're all connected to shipments from companies that don't exist. The patterns are there. If you know where to look, I've got a notebook full of names, drivers, routes, cargo types. I'm building a case, piece by piece, to find the bastards running this show. Last week, I got a lead. A driver named Lena said she'd hauled for a company called Next Tech Solutions. Same MO as my job. Strict instructions, high pay, weird vibes. She didn't get stuck, but her cargo vanished mid-trip, and her truck's computer logged errors it shouldn't have. Next Tech's gone now, no surprise. But I found a warehouse they used in Indiana. I'm heading there tomorrow, alone. If I don't come back, maybe someone will hear this and keep digging. The warehouse was a bust, empty, just like the others. But I found something, a scrap of paper with a logo, a stylized clock with no hands. It's a symbol, a clue. I've seen it before, on a shipping manifest from another driver's story. This isn't over. I still hear Bobby on the CB. His voice weaker now, like he's fading. He says the loops are getting stronger, pulling in more drivers. I can't let that happen. I'm not a hero. I'm just a trucker who got caught in something bigger than me. But I can't unsee what I've seen. Can't unfeel the way time bends around me now. I'll keep driving, keep searching, until I find the truth or it finds me. The road doesn't scare me anymore. But the cargo does, and out there, in the dark, someone's still running those experiments, waiting for the next driver to fall into their trap. Story number 9. My hands gripped the wheel of my rig, the hum of the engine steady as the endless highway stretched before me under a blood-red sunset. I'd driven this route 100 times, every curve and mile marker etched into my mind like a map I could read blind. But tonight, something was wrong. I blinked, and the road ahead vanished. Not the asphalt, but my memory of it. Where was I going? Why couldn't I recall the last town I'd passed? The dashboard clock glowed 3:17 a.m., but I swore it was dusk just moments ago. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I didn't even know my own destination. I pulled over to a desolate rest stop, the kind where the vending machines flicker and the air smells of diesel and regret. My logbook sat open on the passenger seat, its pages filled with my own handwriting, dates, routes, deliveries, but none of it made sense. I stared at an entry from yesterday. Montana facility, biocargo, priority. I had no memory of writing it. My fingers trembled as I flipped back, finding dozens of similar entries, trips I'd apparently taken over years, all to the same place, a place I couldn't remember. The night pressed in, heavy and suffocating, as I tried to call my dispatcher, and my phone was in my hand, the number half dialed. But my mind went blank. Why was I calling? I checked the call log, 5 missed calls to a number I didn't recognize. My heart pounded as I redialed, only to hear a cold, automated voice. This number does not exist. I looked at the cargo manifest again. Its pages thick with psychological tests and brain scan images. Why, what kind of delivery was this, and why did it feel like I was the one being delivered? By dawn, the gaps in my mind were growing, swallowing entire hours. I remembered starting my truck in Virginia, but now I was in Colorado, with no recollection of the states in between. My GPS showed a route I didn't recall programming, leading to a pinprick in rural Montana. The cargo in my trailer, refrigerated containers marked biosamples, hummed with an eerie rhythm, like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. I tried to focus, but my thoughts slipped away, leaving only one certainty. Something was stealing my memories, and it wasn't stopping. That night, I woke to whispers outside my cab. Two figures in white coats stood by my trailer, their voices low and clinical. "Subject 47's cognitive baseline is degrading as expected," one said, jotting notes. "He's ready for final processing." My blood ran cold. I wasn't just a driver, I was their experiment. My mind a resource they were harvesting. The cargo wasn't samples, it was memories. Stolen from drivers like me, I had to escape. But how do you outrun something that's already inside your head? In August 2021, Kevin received an unusual contract through his dispatcher, a high-paying delivery job that required a driver with an impeccable safety record and the ability to handle confidential cargo. I'd been hauling freight across the country for 12 years. My memory, sharp as a tack. I could tell you the exact diner in Nebraska where I had the best apple pie in 17, or the shortcut through Wyoming that saved me 3 hours in a blizzard. That's why the call from my dispatcher, Eddie, raised no red flags at first. The job was to haul sensitive cargo from a biotech lab in Virginia to a research facility in Montana. The pay was a small fortune, enough to make me overlook the odd request for confidentiality. I arrived at the lab just outside Richmond, a sleek glass building that looked more like a spaceship than a research center. Kevin picked up the cargo at a modern biotechnology facility outside of Richmond, where he was met by scientists in white lab coats, who supervised the loading of dozens of small containers filled with what appeared to be biological samples. The containers were loaded into my trailer's refrigeration unit, each one sealed with a digital lock and a temperature monitor. The lead scientist, a wiry man with cold eyes, handed me a folder thicker than a phone book. Instead of normal shipping documents, Kevin received a thick folder filled with psychological assessment forms, memory evaluation tests, and what appeared to be brain scan images. I raised an eyebrow. "This ain't standard," I said, flipping through pages of questions about my childhood, my first rig, my favorite routes. The scientist smiled thinly. The lead scientist explained that the research facility required detailed background information about all drivers who delivered to their location, ostensibly for security clearance purposes. I shrugged, filled out the forms, and hit the road, thinking it was just bureaucratic nonsense for a high-security gig. The drive started smooth. Interstate 64 cutting through Virginia's rolling hills, the sun dipping low as I crossed into Kentucky. Kevin began his journey westward, taking Interstate 64 through Virginia and Kentucky before connecting to Interstate 70 through Missouri and into Colorado. But by the second day, something felt off. I'd always prided myself on knowing every mile of my route, but now I couldn't recall passing through Lexington. My GPS showed I had taken the right exits, but my mind was blank. Kevin had never experienced memory problems before, and prided himself on his ability to recall every detail of his trips. I chalked it up to a long night, maybe too much coffee, but the gaps kept coming. By Missouri, I'd lose entire towns, entire hours. I'd pull into a truck stop and find a receipt in my pocket for fuel I didn't remember buying. My logbook, my lifeline, was filled with my own handwriting, routes, times, stops, but it was like reading a stranger's diary. The deeper I drove into the Midwest, the worse it got. As Kevin continued westward, the memory lapses became more frequent and more significant. I'd find myself at a diner, a plate of half-eaten eggs in front of me, with no idea how I'd gotten there. My phone showed calls I didn't remember making, texts I didn't recall sending. It was like my mind was a puzzle, and someone was stealing the pieces one by one. I tried calling Eddie, but every time I dialed, my thoughts scattered. Kevin tried calling his dispatcher to report the memory problems, but every time he attempted to make the call, he would forget why he was calling before the number finished dialing. Then came the real gut punch. Kevin realized that he wasn't just losing memories of the current trip. He was losing memories from throughout his entire driving career. Routes I'd driven for years, Interstate 80 through Nevada, the back roads of Ohio, felt like places I'd never been. Truck stops where I'd swapped stories with waitresses for a decade were suddenly foreign. My whole life as a driver, 12 years of it, was slipping through my fingers like sand. I pulled over in Colorado, my hands shaking as I opened my logbook. Kevin pulled over at a rest area in Colorado to assess his situation and discovered something that terrified him. His normally meticulous logbooks, which he had maintained for over 12 years, now contained entries he didn't remember writing and references to trips he couldn't recall taking. The pages were a nightmare. Entries described deliveries to a Montana facility, dozens of them stretching back years. Some of the entries described deliveries to the same Montana research facility he was currently traveling to, deliveries that Kevin had apparently made multiple times but had no memory of completing. I traced the dates, trips I'd supposedly taken every few months, each one paired with medical forms, psychological tests and brain scans, and I wasn't just losing my memory, someone was taking it piece by piece and replacing it with nothing. I tried to dig deeper. I called the biotech company's number from the contract. Kevin tried to call the biotechnology company that had hired him, but when he dialed the number on his contract, he discovered that it was disconnected. Online searches turned up nothing, no website, no record. Like the company had vanished into thin air. Fear settled in my bones, cold and heavy. This wasn't a delivery job. This was something else, something that wanted my mind. That night, in a Utah rest stop, I woke to voices. That evening, while Kevin was sleeping in his truck at a rest area in Utah, he was awakened by voices outside his cab. I stayed still, peering through the curtain. Two figures in white coats stood by my trailer, one holding a clipboard, the other pointing a device at the cargo. The researchers were discussing Kevin's memory extraction progress and noting that his cognitive baseline was deteriorating according to their expectations. They called me Subject 47, said I was ready for final processing in Montana. My heart stopped as they explained what my cargo really was. Not samples, but memories, stolen from drivers like me, stored in those containers like data on a hard drive. They referred to Kevin as Subject 47 and mentioned that he was scheduled for final processing when he reached the Montana facility. The truth hit me like a freight train. The biological samples he was transporting weren't research materials at all. They were extracted memories and experiences from previous trucker subjects who had been processed at the Montana facility. My job, my life, my memories, they were all part of an experiment to harvest what I knew, what I'd lived. I wasn't delivering cargo, I was the cargo. I waited until they left, then fired up my rig and peeled out of the rest stop. After the researchers left, Kevin immediately started his truck and fled the rest area, abandoning his planned route to the Montana facility, but the road was no refuge. As he drove through the night, Kevin discovered that his memory problems were accelerating rapidly. I couldn't remember the last 10 minutes, let alone the last 10 years, and every mile I drove, I lost more of myself. How to shift gears, how to read a map, how to be a driver, and by the time I hit Salt Lake City, I was barely holding it together, and I stumbled into a hospital, my logbook clutched in my hands, begging for help. The doctors didn't believe me at first. Medical staff found his story incredible, but were alarmed by the rapid progression of his symptoms. They ran tests, their faces grim as the scans came back. Brain scans revealed unusual patterns of neural activity that were consistent with artificial memory manipulation. My cargo was analyzed. Those biosamples weren't tissue or blood. The samples were suspended in a synthetic fluid that contained complex neural networks and what appeared to be digitized brain activity patterns. They were memories, crystallized and stored, ready to be implanted into someone else. I told the police everything, and they dug into the biotech company. The investigation into the memory extraction operation revealed a sophisticated network involving multiple biotechnology companies and research facilities across the country. It wasn't just me. Truckers were being systematically targeted and recruited for fake delivery jobs that allowed researchers to study their memories and gradually extract their accumulated knowledge and experience. The Montana facility was a ghost. The Montana facility that Kevin was supposed to deliver to was found abandoned with evidence that it had been hastily evacuated when Kevin failed to arrive as scheduled. Months later, I was a shell of who I'd been. Kevin's condition stabilized after several weeks of treatment, but his memory never fully recovered. I could still tie my shoes, remember my wife's smile, but my life as a driver? Gone. He couldn't remember how to operate a commercial vehicle, had no knowledge of routes or regulations, and felt no familiarity with the industry he had worked in for over a decade. It was like someone had cut out half my soul and sold it to the highest bidder. The investigation uncovered a horror show. Hospital records from across the country revealed dozens of cases of truckers experiencing sudden onset memory loss, early dementia, and cognitive deterioration that couldn't be explained by normal medical causes. Drivers like me, lured by high-paying contracts, stripped of their lives among the samples. Investigators found memories that belonged to drivers who had been reported missing over the past 5 years. Their experiences, their expertise, bottled up like wine in those containers. I never went back to trucking. Kevin never returned to trucking, but has become an advocate for driver safety and rights. I work with other victims now, men and women who wake up one day and can't remember the roads they've driven for years. Kevin still receives occasional communications from what appear to be other victims of the memory extraction program. We share stories, try to piece together what's left of our minds. The worst part, knowing that somewhere out there, someone's driving with my memories, my life, while I'm left with nothing but questions. The network's still out there, hidden behind fake companies and empty facilities. The investigation into the memory extraction operation remains active, but authorities have struggled to locate the main research facility or identify the individuals responsible for the program. Every time I close my eyes, I see those containers, glowing in the dark of my trailer. My memories, someone else's now, scattered across a black market for human experience. And I wonder how many more drivers are out there, losing themselves 1 mile at a time. Story number 10. I was halfway through Nevada's endless desert, the kind of stretch where the horizon blurs into a mirage, when I heard it, a voice on my CB radio, crisp and cold, calling me Subject M47. It wasn't the usual trucker banter, no good buddy or road stories. This was clinical, like scientists dissecting a lab rat. They knew my exact location, my cargo, even how I took my coffee. Black, no sugar, but I never told anyone that. My gut churned as I gripped the wheel, the night closing in like a trap. The contract had come out of nowhere, a haul from Arizona to a remote medical facility in Alaska, paying 10 times my usual rate. 10 times, I'd been driving long haul for 14 years, and I'd seen my share of odd jobs, but this felt wrong, like a deal you make with the devil. The paperwork mentioned biological research materials, sealed in temperature-controlled containers. I didn't think much of it then. I should have. Before I could even load the cargo in Arizona, they put me through the ringer. Blood tests, brain scans, psychological evaluations, 8 hours of poking and prodding. They said it was for biosecurity. But why did they need my vocal patterns, my DNA, my childhood memories? I felt like a specimen, not a driver. The medical staff's smiles were too perfect, their eyes too cold. I should have walked away right then, as I crossed into Canada. The CB chatter turned sinister. They were tracking me, not just my truck, my habits, my routes, my life. They spoke of compatibility ratings and replacement procedures, terms that made my skin crawl. I tried to respond, but the radio went dead every time I touched the mic. I was alone, but I wasn't. Someone, or something, was watching, waiting for me at the end of that 200-mile dirt road. When I reached the Alaska facility, it wasn't a hospital. It was a fortress carved into a mountain, guarded by razor wire and men with no names for Jigdanye. This wasn't about medicine. The air felt heavy, like it carried secrets too big to breathe. I knew then I wasn't just delivering cargo. I was the cargo, and whatever waited inside those underground halls was about to change everything I thought I knew about myself. In December 2021, I was contracted for what appeared to be a routine medical supply delivery from a pharmaceutical distribution center in Arizona to a private medical facility in northern Alaska. I'd been driving trucks for 14 years, known for never missing a deadline. My name's Michael Torres, and I'd built a reputation as the guy who could handle any route, any weather. The unusual aspect of the job was the remote destination. The facility was located over 200 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single unpaved road that required special permits and winter driving equipment. I'd done Alaska runs before, so I wasn't fazed. The cold was brutal, but my rig was kitted out with snow chains, thermal blankets, and enough supplies to last a month. The pay was extraordinary, but nearly 10 times my normal rate. Justified by the extreme isolation and harsh winter conditions, I figured it was a once-in-a-lifetime gig. Who says no to that kind of money? The cargo consisted of medical equipment and supplies sealed in temperature-controlled containers, along with what the shipping documents described as biological research materials that required careful handling and precise environmental controls. I'd hauled sensitive stuff before, vaccines, lab samples, so I didn't blink. But the loading process, that's where things got weird. The pickup process at the Arizona facility was more extensive than I expected. In addition to loading the cargo, I was required to undergo a comprehensive medical examination that included blood tests, brain scans, and detailed psychological assessments. They had me hooked up to machines I'd never seen, wires snaking across my chest, my head. They asked questions that dug deep, my fears, my regrets. The name of my first dog. The medical staff explained that these procedures were required for anyone entering the Alaska facility due to biosecurity protocols and the sensitive nature of the research being conducted there. I bought it at first. High security labs have rules, right? But then they started measuring things that didn't add up. My vocal cadence, the way I walked, even the scars on my knuckles from a bar fight in '09. The examination included detailed measurements of my physical characteristics, vocal pattern analysis, and even genetic testing that required multiple tissue samples. They took swabs from my mouth, clipped my nails, plucked hairs. 8 hours later, I was exhausted, but they said it was all standard. The entire process took over 8 hours, but the medical staff assured me that the results would be processed before I reached the Alaska facility. I climbed into my rig, uneasy but ready to roll. The road north was a beast. Nevada's deserts gave way to Idaho's mountains, then Canada's endless forests. I began my journey northward, driving through Nevada, Idaho, and into Canada before crossing into Alaska. The weather turned nasty as I hit the Arctic Circle, snow piling high, visibility dropping to nothing, but I'd driven worse. The first several days of travel were routine, and I made good time despite increasingly harsh weather conditions as I traveled into the Arctic. My rig growled through the ice, steady as ever. Then the CB crackled to life, and everything changed. As I approached the final stretch of my journey, the 200-mile unpaved road to the research facility, I began to notice unusual radio transmissions on my CB. They weren't truckers swapping stories about diner food or shortcuts. These voices were sharp, precise, like air traffic controllers on a secret mission. The transmissions weren't normal trucker chatter, but rather technical discussions between people who seemed to be monitoring my progress. They knew my coordinates down to the meter, the weight of my cargo, even how many times I'd stopped for gas. The conversations included detailed information about my location, my cargo status, and even personal details about my driving habits and route preferences. What froze my blood was how they referred to me, Subject M47. Not Michael, not Torres, just a number. Most disturbing was that the people on the radio referred to me by a numerical designation, subject M47, rather than my name. I grabbed the mic, my voice shaking. "Who's this? What do you want?" Silence. I tried to respond to the radio transmissions, but whenever I keyed my microphone, the conversations would immediately stop. It was like they could see me, but I couldn't see them. The monitoring seemed to be one way, with the unknown observers tracking my every move while remaining hidden from my attempts to communicate. I started wondering if my rig was bugged. I began to suspect that my truck had been equipped with surveillance equipment during the loading process in Arizona. Had they slipped something in while I was getting poked and prodded? I checked the dashboard, the undercarriage, but found nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me like damp cold. The road ahead was a ribbon of dirt and ice, winding through mountains that seemed to lean in, whispering secrets. I was alone, but I wasn't. Someone knew every mile I drove, every breath I took. As I approached the research facility, the radio transmissions became more frequent and more specific. They talked about my compatibility rating, said my baseline measurements were within acceptable parameters. The observers were discussing my compatibility rating and noting that my baseline measurements matched their requirements within acceptable parameters. Then came the kicker. Replacement procedure approved. Integration Team Alpha, standing by. They also mentioned that the replacement procedure had been approved and that Integration Team Alpha was standing by for my arrival. My hands tightened on the wheel. Replacement? What the hell did that mean? I had no idea what any of these terms meant, but the clinical nature of the discussions made me increasingly uncomfortable. My mind raced. Was this about the cargo, the medical exam, or something worse? I began to suspect that the medical examination in Arizona had been more than just a security clearance, and that I might be walking into a situation far more dangerous than a routine delivery. I thought about turning back, but the road was a one-way ticket. I considered turning around and abandoning the delivery, but I was already too far into the wilderness to safely retreat without completing the journey. No gas stations, no towns, just ice and darkness. When I finally saw the facility, my stomach dropped. The research facility itself was unlike anything I had ever seen. Instead of a normal medical building, the complexes consisted of several interconnected structures built into the side of a mountain, with most of the facility apparently underground. It looked like a military base, not a lab. The surface buildings were heavily fortified and surrounded by security fences and guard towers. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their breath visible in the freezing air. The entire complex had the appearance of a military installation rather than a medical research center. I was met at the facility's gate by security personnel who conducted another thorough inspection of my truck and cargo before allowing me to proceed to the loading dock. They scanned every inch of my rig, their faces hidden behind reflective visors. The unloading process was supervised by technicians in full biological containment suits, and I was required to remain in a designated waiting area while my cargo was transferred to the facility's interior systems. The waiting area was sterile, all white walls and buzzing lights. I sat there, my nerves fraying, listening to muffled voices through the walls. While waiting for the cargo transfer to be completed, I overheard conversations between facility staff that revealed the terrifying truth about the research being conducted at the location. They weren't talking about curing diseases or developing drugs. The facility wasn't involved in medical research at all. It was a cloning and replacement center where perfect duplicates of selected individuals were being created for purposes I couldn't fully comprehend from the fragments of conversation I heard. Clones. Human clones. My heart pounded as the words sank in. According to what I overheard, the facility had been operating for several years and had successfully created and deployed hundreds of human duplicates. They chose their targets carefully, people with skills, connections, or access to something valuable. The targets for replacement were carefully selected based on their professional skills, social connections, and access to sensitive information or strategic locations. Truckers like me were prime targets. Truckers were particularly valuable targets because their nomadic lifestyle made their disappearances less likely to be noticed. and their knowledge of transportation networks could be exploited for various illegal purposes. I realized with growing horror that I hadn't been hired to deliver cargo to the facility. I had been lured there to be replaced by a duplicate. The medical exam in Arizona wasn't for biosecurity, it was to map me, body and soul. The extensive medical examination in Arizona had been used to create a detailed biological profile that would allow the facility to grow a perfect clone with all of my memories, skills, and physical characteristics. The cargo I'd hauled, the biological research materials I had transported were probably genetic samples and neural mapping data from other truckers who had already been processed. I was just the next in line. I wasn't a driver anymore, I was prey. My mind screamed to run, but where? The facility was a maze of steel and secrets, buried in a mountain. I had to stay calm, play along, find a way out. I tried to leave the facility immediately, but I discovered that my truck had been disabled while I was in the waiting area. The engine wouldn't turn over. The facility security staff politely but firmly explained that I would need to remain overnight while final processing was completed. They led me to a guest quarters, but it was no hotel room. I was escorted to what was described as guest quarters. But the room was clearly a holding cell with reinforced doors and no windows. The walls were thick, the air stale. I was trapped. During the night, I could hear activity throughout the facility, machinery operating, people moving through corridors, and what sounded like construction or assembly work. The sounds were mechanical, rhythmic, like a factory running at full tilt. Most disturbing were the voices I heard in adjacent rooms, voices that sounded exactly like my own voice. Having conversations I had never had, my own voice, laughing, talking about routes I'd never driven, people I'd never met. I realized that my duplicate was already being prepared and programmed with artificial memories designed to allow it to seamlessly replace me. I was hearing my own replacement come to life. Panic clawed at my chest. I had to get out before they finished whatever they were doing. I searched the room, my hands shaking, and found a ventilation grate behind a loose panel. I managed to escape from my holding cell by using a maintenance access panel I discovered hidden behind a ventilation grate. The service corridors were dark, damp, lined with pipes that hummed with purpose. I moved quietly, my heart in my throat. As I moved through the facility's service corridors, I encountered something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Dozens of growth chambers containing partially developed human clones in various stages of completion. They floated in glowing tanks, their bodies half-formed, eyes closed, but somehow watching. Each chamber was labeled with detailed information about the original person being duplicated, including truckers, government officials, and business executives. Names, ages, occupations, all laid out like a catalogue. Most horrifying was what I found in the facility's storage areas, hundreds of containers filled with what appeared to be discarded human remains. The labels were clinical, subject terminated post-replacement. According to the labels on the containers, these were the original biological materials from people who had been successfully replaced by their duplicates. They weren't just cloning, they were killing. The facility wasn't just creating clones, and it was systematically murdering the original people and disposing of their bodies. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The air felt thick with death. I stumbled through the storage area, my boots echoing on the concrete. Then I found my truck in the facility's garage. I located my truck in the facility's garage and discovered that it had been equipped with additional monitoring and control systems that would allow the facility to track and manipulate my movements if my duplicate was deployed. Wires and trackers were grafted onto the engine. The dashboard. I also found evidence that many other truckers had delivered to this facility over the years and that their trucks had been similarly modified before their duplicates were sent back into the world. I had one chance when I managed to escape from the facility by creating a distraction in the power distribution system that temporarily disabled the security systems. I flipped switches, yanked cables, and prayed. The lights flickered, alarms blared, and I ran for my rig. As I drove away from the complex, I could see search teams being deployed to recapture me, but I knew these roads. My knowledge of winter driving in extreme conditions allowed me to evade pursuit and reach civilization. The snow was my ally, hiding my tracks as I floored it. I made it to a small Alaskan town and contacted the feds. I immediately contacted federal authorities and reported my experience, but the truth was worse than I'd imagined. When law enforcement agencies attempted to locate the facility, they found only an abandoned research station that had been hastily evacuated. The underground sections were gone, blown to rubble. The underground portions of the complex had been sealed with explosives, and all evidence of the cloning operation had been removed or destroyed. Most disturbing was what investigators discovered when they began checking on other truckers who had made deliveries to remote facilities in recent years. Dozens of drivers had come back different. Over 40 drivers who had accepted similar high-paying jobs to isolated locations had returned from their deliveries, exhibiting subtle changes in personality and behavior. Their families noticed it. Small things like forgetting a favorite joke or driving a route they'd never taken. Family members and close friends reported that these drivers seemed different in ways that were difficult to define but impossible to ignore. Medical examinations of these drivers revealed anomalies that were consistent with advanced cloning technology, DNA markers that didn't belong, brain scans showing artificial patterns, DNA tests showed microscopic genetic markers that shouldn't have been present in naturally conceived humans, and brain scans revealed neural patterns that suggested artificial memory implantation, and most drivers had no clue. Most of the affected drivers had no memory of anything unusual about their deliveries and insisted that they were the same people they had always been. I got tested too. I underwent extensive testing and was confirmed to be genetically authentic. But investigators warned me that my duplicate was almost certainly still in operation somewhere. My clone was out there, driving my routes, using my name. The clone would have all of my memories up to the point of the medical examination in Arizona, along with artificially implanted experiences designed to explain the gap in its memories. It was me, but not me, and it was living my life. The investigation revealed that the cloning and replacement program was far more extensive than initially suspected. It wasn't just Alaska, and similar facilities were believed to exist in remote locations across North America and possibly worldwide. The feds linked it to crime syndicates, maybe even governments. The program appeared to be connected to organized crime networks that were using replaced individuals to infiltrate transportation systems, government agencies, and other strategic sectors of society. I quit trucking. I retired from trucking immediately after my escape, and now work with federal agencies to identify potential cloning operations and locate other victims of the replacement program. I live under constant watch, carrying IDs to prove I'm me. I live under constant surveillance and use multiple forms of identification to prove my authenticity to family and friends. But the worst part, several of my longtime trucking contacts reported receiving visits from someone claiming to be Michael, someone who looked and sounded exactly like me, but knew details about recent jobs and experiences that the real Michael had never had. My clone is out there, building a life I'll never know. The scariest part? I don't know who's real anymore. Every trucker I pass on the highway, every face in a diner, could they be one of them? The most chilling aspect of my story is the ongoing uncertainty about how many people in various professions have been replaced by duplicates without anyone's knowledge. The tech is too advanced, the plan too big. The technology demonstrated at the Alaska facility was decades ahead of publicly known cloning capabilities, suggesting that the replacement program has been operating for much longer than investigators initially suspected, and it's still out there, waiting for the next driver to take the wrong job. Story number 11. I clutch the wheel, my knuckles white, as the desert stretches endless before me. The sky is a bruise, heavy with stars that seem to watch my every move. My truck hums through the Nevada night, but something feels wrong. Too quiet, too still. I've driven these roads for 18 years, but tonight, The air carries a weight, like the world is holding its breath. Then I see it. A faint glow on the horizon, not a town, not a star, a place that shouldn't exist. This account comes from veteran driver Sarah Mitchell, who had been driving long haul for 18 years. I thought I'd seen it all. Blizzards, breakdowns, sleepless nights on endless highways, but nothing prepared me for the call that changed everything. A voice I didn't recognize crackled through my phone, offering a job unlike any other. The job involved transporting archived research materials from a storage facility in Nevada to a destination that would be provided en route. The pay was astronomical, nearly $50,000 for a single delivery. I should have hung up right then. But the contract included unusual clauses requiring absolute secrecy and forbidding me from discussing the cargo or destination with anyone. Curiosity, or maybe greed, pulled me in. The pickup point was no ordinary depot. The pickup location was a massive warehouse complex in the Nevada desert surrounded by military-style security. Barbed wire glinted under floodlights, and armed guards checked my ID 3 times before waving me through. Sarah was required to undergo extensive background verification and sign documents she wasn't allowed to read. My hands shook as I signed, the papers heavy with fine print I wasn't allowed to see. The loading dock was a maze of steel and concrete, buzzing with activity. The cargo consisted of hundreds of file boxes, computer servers, and what appeared to be biological preservation equipment. I watched as workers in hazmat suits moved crates marked with symbols I didn't recognize, symbols that seemed to twist when I stared too long. Symbols. As the cargo loaded, I caught snippets of conversation that made my stomach churn. They were discussing Project Night Road, an ongoing operation collecting data on supernatural encounters and unexplained phenomena. The workers didn't know I was listening, their voices low but clear. They spoke of highways as testing grounds, of events orchestrated to study human fear. Every strange encounter truckers reported was part of a coordinated experiment. My mind raced. Every ghost story, every late-night tale swapped at diners was real. They mentioned subjects, drivers like me, watched and manipulated. The archived materials contained documentation of thousands of trucker encounters with ghosts, time loops, and phantom truck stops. I realized I wasn't hauling papers. I was carrying proof of something monstrous. The drive began under a starless sky. Sarah began her journey, receiving destination coordinates through an encrypted communication system installed in her truck. The device was sleek, alien, bolted to my dashboard without explanation. The destination was a facility in the Colorado mountains. I drove, the road unspooling like a dark ribbon. But the silence was oppressive. Then it started. Shadows moved in my mirrors, not trucks, not cars, but shapes that flickered and vanished. 3 trucks appeared, maintaining perfect formation, responding to my speed changes with uncanny precision. I floored it, but they matched me, their headlights cold and unblinking. When Sarah tried to contact them on her CB radio, she heard voices of drivers long dead. "Turn back, Sarah," they whispered, their voices crackling with static. I gripped the wheel tighter, my heart pounding. In Utah, the road betrayed me. Sarah's GPS began directing her onto roads that didn't exist. The screen flickered, showing exits that led to nowhere. I followed, desperate, and found myself in a place that wasn't right. Towns with no names, their windows dark but filled with faces. She passed abandoned towns filled with people in nightgowns who watched her truck with hungry eyes. They stood motionless, their eyes glinting like animals in the dark. My radio hummed, spitting out voices describing weather from years I wasn't born in. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt trapped. The psychological pressure intensified as Sarah drove through Colorado. Every mile brought new horrors, each one sharper, more real. Then came the passenger. Sarah picked up a hitchhiker who appeared to be a young woman in distress. She stood by the road, her face pale, her hands trembling. I stopped, against my better judgment. She climbed in, her eyes hidden in shadow. The hitchhiker revealed herself as something inhuman with black eyes and pointed teeth. "You're close," she hissed, her voice like gravel. She told Sarah she was approaching the source of all supernatural activity. I swerved, nearly crashing, as her face twisted into something not human. I forced her out, but her laughter lingered in the cab. The cargo itself turned against me. Sarah's truck began experiencing phenomena as the cargo started moving. The crates rattled, not with loose bolts, but with purpose. When she investigated, she discovered the archived files were alive, containing captured supernatural entities. I opened one box, just a crack, and saw eyes staring back, eyes that weren't human. The organization had been trapping ghosts, demons, and paranormal beings. My truck felt like a cage, carrying things that shouldn't exist. I drove faster, the Colorado mountains looming closer. A truck stop appeared, glowing in the fog. Sarah encountered a 24-hour truck stop that existed only in supernatural space. It looked welcoming, with neon signs and warm light, but my gut screamed to keep driving. The staff tried to convince her to stay and install mysterious devices on her truck. They smiled too wide, their eyes too bright. Sarah realized this location was a processing center for supernatural encounters. I saw drivers I recognized, men and women who'd gone missing years ago, now serving coffee like nothing was wrong. The staff revealed Sarah was selected to be the final test subject in Project Night Road. They wanted me to stay, to become part of their experiment. I refused. Sarah discovered every supernatural encounter was connected to this facility. Every ghost truck, every impossible road, every lost driver. They all led here. The organization was creating supernatural phenomena using technology and captured entities. They were testing how far they could push the human mind. The ultimate goal was to control human perception and memory on a massive scale. I saw it then. Their plan wasn't just about truckers, it was about everyone. The facility loomed ahead, a fortress of steel and shadow. The facility served as the central command for all supernatural activity. Its walls pulsed with a hum I felt in my bones. Every ghost truck, phantom location, and impossible encounter was orchestrated from this location. I knew what I had to do. Instead of delivering the materials, Sarah drove her truck into the facility's main building, causing a massive explosion. The impact was blinding, the heat swallowing everything. The destruction released hundreds of trapped supernatural entities. I saw them, shapes of light and shadow, fleeing into the night. Phantom truck stops disappeared, time loops collapsed, and trapped spirits were freed. I woke in a hospital, my body broken but alive. Sarah survived the explosion but was severely injured. Doctors whispered about miracles, but I knew the truth. She was debriefed by federal agents who revealed Project Night Road had been under investigation. They told me I'd done what they couldn't, broken the machine. The organization had facilities on every continent. I learned their reach was global. Their experiments not limited to highways. Sarah's actions disrupted their operations, but other facilities remained active. The fight wasn't over. The supernatural encounters might have ended, but the human organizations behind them continue to pose a threat. Months later, I still see those faces in my dreams, the hitchhiker, the drivers, the eyes in the crates. Drive now, but the roads feel different, emptier, yet I know they're out there, watching, waiting. The unseen network isn't gone, it's just hidden better now, and I wonder, every night, if I'll ever truly escape.